The anchor frame commission was 3 weeks behind before I set foot on Core 7, and none of that was my fault. The prior contractor had spec'd the southern load path using Verath-grade composite, which sounds reasonable until you know that Verath-grade composite has a 17% thermal contraction coefficient on moons with a diurnal temperature swing wider than 40 degrees. Core 7's diurnal swing is 61. I know this because I checked. The prior contractor apparently had not. 6 weeks of foundation pour, curing, and frame assembly, all of it with material that was going to pull itself apart inside 2 winters. The compact bilateral office had already approved the original plans. Somebody somewhere had signed something without reading it, and now I was standing on a basalt shelf in a wind that tasted of mineral dust and cold, looking at 12 meters of anchor frame that needed to come out and go back in correctly. And the Joint Treaty Commission was watching the calendar like a man watches a wound. I noted the scope change in my site log, filed the material substitution request through the bilateral engineering office using the expedited review pathway, which I had used before and which the bilateral office understood, if not entirely welcomed, and got to work. That was day 1. The diplomatic party arrived on day 4. I was below grade at the time, inside the secondary anchor trench, fitting the first of the revised load transfer collars. The trench was 6 meters deep at that section, and the work lamp cast a flat white light on composite and basalt that made everything look the same shade. I heard the transport land on the pad above me, the low hydraulic percussion of a diplomatic-class courier settling its landing struts, and I heard Oren Veem, my site coordinator, go out to receive it. Oren was a young Vethrani, precise and quietly anxious, the kind of person who solves problems by anticipating them 2 days in advance and then worrying about the solutions. He was good at his work. He was also, I had noticed, slightly unnerved by me, which I attributed to the rig and did not take personally. I registered the transport and the receiving party and filed them in the part of my mind that tracks things not directly relevant to the task at hand. The Joint Commission had flagged a diplomatic inspection on the project calendar. Diplomats were not my concern. The collar fitting was. I had 4 of them to complete before the curing window on the bearing course compound closed, and the compound waited for nobody. The child appeared at the trench edge about 20 minutes later. I was aware of her before I saw her, a small shadow crossing the work lamp's cone of light above me, then a stillness that meant someone crouching or sitting at the rim. I looked up. She was sitting cross-legged at the edge of the trench with her hands folded in her lap, watching me work. Small, maybe waist height if she stood. Lavender skin. Silver hair pulled back with a plain cord. Amber eyes that were doing something I recognized immediately, because I had watched engineers look at an unfamiliar joint the same way. Not passively, not idly, but with genuine concentration, the specific attention of someone who is trying to understand the thing in front of them, and is not yet satisfied that they do. She did not say anything, she just watched. I went back to the collar fitting. She stayed at the rim. After 3 minutes of this, without looking up, I said, "If you want to ask a question, ask it." A pause, a short one, not a hesitant one, more the pause of someone calibrating. Then, why does it have to go in at that angle? Because the load is not coming straight down, I said. It comes down and sideways. The angle of the collar matches the angle of the load. If I put it in straight, the load shears the collar instead of transferring through it. Another pause, this one with a different quality, the quality of someone thinking. What happens if it shears? The frame moves. How bad is that? 14,000 people on the other side of this corridor anchor are depending on the infrastructure this frame supports. If it moves, the corridor integrity degrades. If the corridor integrity degrades far enough, they lose transit access. If they lose transit access in third season, whether on a Veth range moon, some of them die. I looked up at her. That is how bad. She held my gaze, amber eyes serious and clear, then a single nod, the nod of someone absorbing a fact and filing it correctly. "All right," she said. "What are you doing now?" I told her. She stayed at the rim for the rest of the afternoon. Her name was Sael. I did not find out whose daughter she was until the second morning, by which point it did not change anything. She had come back at first light with a small notebook, a pencil, and a set of questions about load path analysis that were better questions than I had heard from a third of the engineering assistants I had trained in 23 years of field work. She had asked them in order, each one building on the answer to the last, which told me she had thought about the previous day's conversation before she slept. She sat where I told her to sit. She did not touch anything I told her not to touch, and she wrote down what I told her in a methodical, close hand that suggested she was not writing for anyone but herself. On the second morning she asked me what the hardshell was for. I was wearing my full rig, the standard compact heavy engineering hardshell, which consists of a sealed composite helmet, a reinforced chest and shoulder shell, arm-bracing gauntlets and leg guards. It weighs 22 kilograms fully assembled. It is built to tolerate material impact, load failure debris, and sustained thermal exposure. It looks, to anyone who does not know compact engineering infrastructure codes, like military combat armor. I know this. I have been told this by colleagues, by site visitors, by diplomats passing through inspection zones, by 2 border authority officers who stopped me at a checkpoint on the Kess approach corridor and spent 4 minutes reading my credentials with the careful attention of men who are not certain what they are looking at. The rig is not deception, and I have never used it as one. It is simply a fact about the world that certain things look like certain other things, and people draw the available inference, and I have never gone out of my way to correct the inference, because the inference keeps people out of active construction zones, and active construction zones are places where people who are not paying the right kind of attention can be seriously hurt. Falling material, I said. Load failure in a trench can put 100 kilograms of composite moving at speed into the space a person is standing in. This absorbs the impact. She wrote that down. Then she looked at the rig more carefully, with the same attention she had been giving the collar sequence, and after a moment she said, "There's no weapons mount." "That's correct. And no communications array on the shoulder, and your visor is single layer, not tactical overlay." She looked up at me. "I've been to a lot of garrison reviews." I looked at her. "You know armor specifications." "I look at things while my mother is talking," she said, without any particular tone. Not proud, not performing, just factual. I went back to work. Oren came to update me on the inspection schedule that afternoon. He mentioned, in the tone of someone who assumed I already knew, that the diplomatic delegation was led by the Queen Regnant Ren Veth Sarith, the head of House Veth, and the ranking Vithrani signatory on the bilateral corridor treaty. "She's been at the trench every morning," I said. He looked slightly alarmed. The Queen's daughter has been at the—" "Not the Queen, her daughter," I looked at him. "The small one, silver hair, notebook." He processed this for a moment. "Sael has been at the trench since day 2. She's the Queen's only child, and she's been at the—" He stopped, reorganized. "Should I inform the Queen?" "She's not in any danger. I've positioned her at the rim, not below grade. The trench is stabilized and the primary collar sequence is complete. If the Queen wants to know where her daughter is spending her time, she can ask her daughter." Oren nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who can see no immediate flaw in the logic but is not entirely comfortable with it. He went back to the treaty shed, and I went back to the anchor frame. The thing about children who ask engineering questions is that they ask them without the overlay of professional self-presentation that adult engineers bring. An adult engineer asking about a load path calculation is performing competence at the same time as seeking information. A child asking is only asking. The question is the entire thing. I had spent 23 years answering questions with the second layer, the layer that maintained my professional position in the room, and answering Sael's questions without that layer was something I was not expecting and did not entirely know what to do with. I answered them the way I would answer them if nobody was watching, which meant I answered them completely. She received complete answers the way she received everything, with the notebook and the pencil and the genuine attention, and without the performance of gratitude or enthusiasm that I had come to recognize, in adults, as a sign that they were not actually listening. By the end of the third day, I had told her more about the Anchor Frame Commission than I had told Oren, who was theoretically responsible for understanding the project. This was not intentional. It was the result of answering the questions she asked. The Keth Consortium delegation arrived on day 6. I had worked with the Consortium before, not with this delegation, with their processes, their precedents, their mechanisms. They are a commercial oversight body withstanding to challenge technical specifications on any infrastructure project touching a commercial transit route they have registered interest in. The Veth Corridor is one of those routes. The bilateral corridor anchor project, the one I was building, was going to increase transit throughput on the Veth Corridor by 30% when it was operational, which was good for the 14,000 displaced Vethrani families waiting on the other side of it, and also good, incidentally, for the Keth Consortium's commercial interests. The fact that the Consortium was challenging the project suggested that they wanted something adjusted in their favor before it proceeded, and that they had found the tool to apply that adjustment. The tool they had found was Section 19C of the bilateral treaty. Section 19C prohibits active garrison military personnel from serving as lead engineer on neutral zone construction projects. The prohibition exists because neutral zone infrastructure is supposed to be civilian infrastructure, and putting an active military engineer in charge of building it creates a treaty complication around dual-use fortification. It is a sensible provision. It did not apply to me, because I am not active military and have never been active military. I am a compact civilian engineering corps specialist with a 23-year service record, and a compact infrastructure authority registration that is filed in the Bilateral Engineering Office's documentation archive. The Consortium's delegate, a thin, precise Keth named Vel Korath, argued that my hardshell rig constituted visual evidence of active garrison status sufficient to override documentary evidence to the contrary. He cited a Keth commercial tribunal precedent. He presented his position calmly and with professional courtesy, and he was certain he was going to win. I did not attend the treaty shed meeting where this was argued. Oren attended. He came back 2 hours later looking like a man who had gone in expecting to manage a small procedural problem and had discovered instead that the room was on fire. "They're challenging your lead engineer designation," he said. I put down the rivet driver. "Explain." He explained. When he finished, I said nothing for a moment because I was doing the timeline calculation, the one I had already done on day 1 and had been carrying since, the way you carry a load calculation when you know the numbers are close. If the Consortium filed its formal challenge in the morning, the bilateral office would suspend the project pending review. The review timeline was 4 to 8 months. The resettlement transit window for the displaced families closed in 6. If the corridor anchor was not operational before that window closed, the families lost their interim housing provisions and had nowhere to go. "What does the Queen want from me?" I said. "She wants to know if you can prove civilian status to the Consortium's satisfaction." I thought about this. My credentials were documented. My service record was documented. My compact infrastructure authority registration was documented. All of it was in the Bilateral Engineering Office's archive. None of it was, apparently, sufficient in the face of a man standing in a rig that looked like armor. There was one form of evidence that the Keth Commercial Tribunal's precedent could not override: physical evidence. The precedent was invoked to allow physical observation to override documentary evidence when the two conflicted. It could also be applied the other way. "Tell her I'll come to the treaty shed tomorrow morning," I said. Oren left. I stood in the anchor trench for a moment, looking at the revised collar sequence, 12 collars, each fitted at the calculated angle, each now cured and load-bearing. The secondary bearing course was 3 days from completion. Above it, the anchor frame structure was rising on schedule. The work was correct. The work had always been correct. The question was whether the room was going to let it continue. Sael was sitting at the trench rim with her notebook open. "I heard," she said. "I know you did." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He thinks the rig means you're military." "Yes." "You're not." "No." I told my mother that this morning. When she was asking the delegation what they intended to argue, she paused. She wasn't sure. She hadn't watched you work. I looked at her. The afternoon light on Core 7 comes in low and sharp at the fourth watch, cutting across the basalt from the western ridge, and it was in her face now. The amber eyes slightly narrowed against it, the silver hair lit at the edges. She was looking at the anchor frame, not at me. At the structure above the trench, the thing we had been discussing for 6 days, the geometry of it visible in the way a thing's logic becomes visible when you have been looking at it long enough. "It'll be settled tomorrow," I said. "I know." A pause. "Will you finish the frame?" "Yes," I said. She wrote something in her notebook. I did not ask what. That night I laid out what I was going to do in the morning the way I laid out an anchor sequence procedure, in order, without gaps, with each step depending correctly on the one before it. The rig comes off in sequence. The evidence speaks for itself. The challenge collapses. The work continues. It was a clean procedure. I had no complications about it. I had worn the rig for 23 years because 23 years of heavy construction work makes a man who does not wear a rig considerably less functional and occasionally dead. What it had made of the underlying body was not something I thought about in any particular way. It was the record of the work. That was all it was. And the record was, in this specific situation, the only argument that was going to settle the room. I thought briefly about the 14,000 people and their 6-month window, the way I occasionally thought about the 68,000 people at Orath during the seismic event, or the 31,000 at the Kess secondary hub, or the various other numbers that accumulated across 23 years of building things that held the weight of lives. The numbers were not abstract. They were the reason the collar angle mattered, and the reason the material substitution mattered, and the reason the certification had to be settled in the morning rather than strung out across a 4-month review. A human characteristic, maybe, the inability to separate the structure from the people the structure was for. I did not know whether that was a virtue or simply a way of working that I had developed over time and could not now separate from myself. I knew it kept me careful. I slept well. The treaty shed in the morning was full. The Bilateral Commission representatives, the Consortium delegation, the Queen's senior staff, a legal monitor from the Compact Corridor Authority, and in the back, at a small table that I noted and filed away, Sael, notebook open, pencil in hand. I had not invited her. I had not told her not to come. When I arrived, she was already seated, and the Queen standing at the head of the commission table, tall and silver-haired, and carrying the controlled stillness of someone who had spent years learning how to occupy rooms without being consumed by them, glanced at her daughter, then at me, and said nothing. Vel Korath made his presentation clearly and without hostility. He was not a man given to theater. He laid out Section 19C, the military personnel prohibition, the Keth Tribunal precedent, and the visual evidence of my hardshell rig in careful sequential order, each element building on the one before. He was precise. He was professionally courteous. He was also, I observed, certain he had already won, the specific certainty of a man who has run this play before and knows how it goes. When he finished, the room was quiet. The Queen looked at me. She had not looked at me directly before this point. We had occupied the same installation for 6 days without our paths requiring intersection. She was the treaty signatory, and I was the engineer, and those are not roles that require the people filling them to be in the same room. I had seen her at the landing pad on day 4, and once at a distance crossing the site perimeter, and that was the extent of it. Looking at her now, at the controlled expression and the precise attention and the quality of the stillness she was maintaining, I had the impression of someone who was managing several things at once and was not going to let any of them show. "Engineer Oreth," she said. Her compact was precise, slightly formal, the pronunciation of someone who had learned it as a second language in a formal context. "The Consortium's representative has indicated that documentary evidence alone will not satisfy the challenge. He requires physical confirmation of civilian status." "Yes," I said. "Are you prepared to provide it?" The room was very quiet. "Yes," I said again. I set down my sight log on the floor beside me, and I began removing the rig. The hardshell comes off in sequence. Helmet first, then the chest and shoulder shell, then the arm bracing gauntlets, then the leg guards. Done methodically, it takes about 4 minutes. I had done it thousands of times in conditions ranging from a construction site access point on a fine morning to a trench with water pooling at the base after a weather event. I did it now the same way I always did, each piece lifted clear, unlatched at the seam points, set on the floor with the care of someone who intends to use it again. The helmet came off first. A military helmet carries a tactical array and a communications rig built into the crown and the side panels. Mine had neither. It was a sealed composite shell with a single-layer impact visor and a ventilation system designed for sustained heat management during prolonged construction work. There was nothing on it that could be mistaken for anything other than what it was. Velkoreth's expression did not change when I set it down, but something in the set of his jaw shifted very slightly, the adjustment of a man who is still certain, but has noticed the first fact that is not going quite as planned. The chest and shoulder shell came off next. I heard the Queen make a sound. It was not a large sound. It was the kind of sound that happens before the conscious mind has finished deciding how to respond to something, a small involuntary intake of breath, contained almost immediately but audible in the quiet of the room. I looked at her. She had gone very still. What I was wearing underneath the shell was my standard compact engineering core undershirt, a close-fitted thermal composite weave designed for heat and impact transfer management in sustained construction environments. It leaves the arms bare from the shoulder. I had worn it every working day for 23 years and had long since stopped being aware of what it revealed, the way a man stops noticing a scar he has had since he was 30. 23 years of heavy construction work leaves a record on a human body. Not an invisible record. The shoulders come first, because the shoulders are where the work lives, carrying and setting composite panels that run between 80 and 200 kilograms, done in rotation across 2 decades of projects on moons and stations, and corridor anchor sites across the Veth and Kess and Oreth transit networks. The forearms carry the specific muscle architecture of 23 years of rivet driving, collar fitting, and load assessment work with tools that require sustained controlled force. Not explosive force, not combat force, but the grinding, directional, sustained force of building things correctly that have to stay built. The hands have the thickness and the scar pattern of a man who has worked with hot composite and live load material every working day of his adult life. Compression scars at the wrists and outer forearms where loads have pinned and caught during failure events. The marks of 2 specific incidents, the panel blowout on Veth's second moon that caught my left shoulder, and the anchor bolt failure at the Oreth hub that I felt in the air against my neck for a fraction of a second before the crossframe dropped through the space I had just vacated. Those are larger scars, and they are old scars, and they do not look like wounds. They look like events survived by a body that was already built to survive them. There is no scar pattern in the world that looks like that except the one that comes from building. I set down the gauntlets and stood in the treaty shed in my undershirt and the lower portion of the rig. I did not look around the room. I looked at the Queen, because she was the person I needed to address, and because she had gone very still, and because something in her face was doing something I had not seen on her face before. She was not frightened. She was not appalled. She was recalibrating. The word is the best I have for it. The category she had been carrying for me was the wrong category, and she had just discovered this in a way that could not be walked back, and what was arriving in its place was correct and weighted and entirely unexpected. Velkoreth cleared his throat. The arms bracing marks. I know what they're consistent with, the Queen said. She did not raise her voice. The evenness was still there, but the evenness had a different quality than it had carried 2 minutes ago. She crossed the treaty shed. Not the 3 measured steps of diplomatic approach. She walked across the full width of the room, past the bilateral commission table and the legal monitor and her own senior staff, until she was standing in front of me at a distance of approximately 1 meter. She was taller than most Vithrani, and that was not a small thing, and she stood with the specific posture of someone who knows exactly how much room her height takes up and has long since stopped apologizing for it. She looked at my hands, not at my face. At my hands, the left first, then the right, then the old shoulder scar where the panel blowout had caught me, a broad flat mark that runs from the back of the shoulder down toward the shoulder blade. She looked at each of these things with the same attention she had given the Consortium's presentation, and the same attention that her daughter gave load path diagrams, and I let her, because this was what the morning required, and there was nothing in it that needed managing. Then she looked up. How long, she said, not a question, a demand for precision. 23 years, I said. She held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not an expression exactly, more the dissolution of the one she had been maintaining. It did not make her look weaker. It made her look like someone who had just located the correct ground to stand on, after a period of standing somewhere else. She turned to face Velkoreth. The challenge is withdrawn, she said. Koreth's expression did not change, but the stillness that followed was specific, the stillness of a man who had been certain and was now uncertain and was deciding, in the interval, what to do with that. The precedent I cited establishes that physical observation supersedes. The precedent establishes that physical observation supersedes documentary evidence when the two are in conflict, the Queen said. They are not in conflict here. They are in agreement. Engineer Oreth's physical record is inconsistent with active military service in every measurable particular. Active military personnel carry specific physical markers, trigger callus pattern at the dominant hand, cervical and trapezoid development consistent with combat load carry and weapons handling, impact scarring at the forearms and shins consistent with combat training rather than material failure. None of those markers are present. What is present is 23 years of heavy infrastructure construction, which leaves its own record, and which I am capable of distinguishing. She paused. I have been reviewing garrison and engineering corps personnel since I was 12 years old. The two records do not look the same. I was not attending carefully enough at the start of this week to distinguish which I was looking at. I am attending now. A beat of silence. Then, from the back of the room, I told you. Every head turned. Sael had not looked up from her notebook. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without performance, as a fact being stated to the air. The room held its breath for a moment. The Queen looked at her daughter for a long time. It was a different kind of looking than the looking she had done at my hands, quieter, more internal, the look of a person who is accounting for something. Then something at the corner of her mouth changed briefly, in a direction I had not seen her mouth move before, and she turned back to the commission table. The challenge is formally withdrawn. The bilateral commission will note the withdrawal in the project record. Engineer Orith's civilian designation stands. She looked at me. You may return to work. I picked up my rig. The sequence goes back on in reverse order. I worked through it the way I always worked through it, methodically, each piece checked before the next was added. When I set the helmet down, I picked up my site log from the floor beside it. Velkorith said from the commission table, "Engineer." I turned. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his expression professionally composed, not conceding anything precisely, but no longer holding the position he had entered with. "The material substitution," he said, "compact grade for Verath grade. I reviewed the specification file last night." A pause. "The substitution is correct. The prior contractor's specification was going to fail." "Yes," I said. "The formal review will note that the substitution was warranted and that the project integrity is sound." He paused again. "The frame will hold." "It will," I said. I went back to work. The site was quiet when I got back to the trench. The morning's low wind had dropped, and the basalt was doing what basalt does when the sun is above the eastern ridge, absorbing heat without showing it, radiating it back in the still air near ground level. I descended to the secondary bearing course and began the next sequence in the collar installation, and the familiar weight of the work settled around me the way it always settled. The rig, the tools, the material in front of me, and the load I was building it to carry, and the people on the other side of the transit corridor who were going to be moved by what I was building. Sael was at the rim when I looked up at the end of the first collar installation. She had her notebook open. She had, I realized, come directly from the treaty shed. "She's going to come see the frame," she said. I assumed. "This afternoon, she wants to see the collar sequence." Sael turned a page. I described the angle problem to her last night, the Verath composite. She understood the geometry when I explained it. She asked good questions. I looked at her. "How long did you talk to her?" 2 hours, she wrote something. She couldn't sleep either. I said nothing to that. "She asked me if I thought the frame was going to hold," Sael said. I told her yes. She asked me why I was certain. I told her because I had watched you work every day for a week, and you built the collar sequence the way you said you would, and you checked every fitting twice the way you said you would check them, and you were going to continue building the frame the way you said you would. She looked up. She was quiet for a long time after that. I went back to the collar fitting. After a moment, Sael said, "She also asked me what you were like." I looked up. "I told her you were precise," she said, "and that you answered questions completely, and that you checked every fitting twice and explained why each time I asked." She paused. "She asked if that was all. I said that was the important part." I went back to the collar fitting without answering, because the answer would have been something like yes. That is the important part, and saying so would have been saying more about myself than the moment required. Sael came down to the bearing course level on the 4th day of the remaining sequence, not into the active zone, but to the lower observation platform I had built into the trench structure for exactly this kind of inspection. I had built it on day 3 because I had been working with her at the rim for a week, and I had seen where her questions were going, and the questions she was going to need to ask next required line of sight to the collar assembly, not an overhead view. I had not told her about it. She arrived in the morning and I pointed down into the trench with my chin and said, "Platform, stay on it." She descended without asking why, which told me she already knew why. From the platform she could see the collar installation from the front-face angle, the angle that shows the load transfer geometry rather than the top profile. She set up her notebook on the platform railing and began drawing, which I had not expected. Not writing, drawing. The geometry of the collar sequence, the angles of the transfer architecture, rendered in pencil in her small, methodical hand. I let her work. She let me work. We spent 4 hours below grade together on a basalt moon at the edge of the Veth corridor, doing what we were respectively there to do, and neither of us required the other to be anything other than what they were. At the end of the second hour, she said, without looking up from the drawing, the tertiary bracket sequence, the force vector changes direction at the mid-frame transition point. Yes. The collar angle adjusts to match. 43 degrees instead of 31. She wrote the numbers down, then she went back to drawing. The Queen arrived at the site at the 4th hour of the afternoon watch. She came without staff, just Oren Veem, who stayed outside the perimeter tape with the expression of a man who has been told to stay outside the perimeter tape and is not entirely comfortable with what might happen inside it. She ducked under the tape and crossed the site with the careful, deliberate step of someone who is paying attention to the ground and is not going to pretend otherwise. She stopped at the rim of the trench and looked down at the collar sequence. The 12 fittings, each at the calculated angle, each cured and bearing load. The geometry of the load path architecture visible to anyone who knew what to look for. She looked at it for a long time. The prior contractor, she said, where is the error visible? I told her where to look. She looked. And the new fittings, she said, the difference is in the angle. And the material, and the installation sequence, but yes, primarily the angle. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Sael said the prior specification would have failed in 2 winters. If the first 2 winters were mild, possibly 3. Without any visible indication before the failure. Gradual degradation of load transfer efficiency. The frame would have begun moving in small increments before the visible failure. It would have looked stable until it wasn't. She looked at the collar sequence for a while longer. Then she looked at the anchor frame structure above the trench, and she did what Sael did. She looked at the geometry of it, the load paths, the angles. The logic of a thing built to carry weight in the direction that weight was actually moving. She looked at it the way she had looked at my hands in the treaty shed, with the specific attention of someone who is trying to understand the thing in front of them, and is not going to perform understanding as a substitute for having it. 23 years, she said. Yes. Where did you work before this commission? The Kess Moon Chain Anchor Projects. Before that, the Orath Secondary Transit Network. Before that, the Inner Corridor Infrastructure Expansion, the major anchor frames that supported the civilian transit build-out in the 3rd decade. She turned, the Orath Spur Anchor. Yes. The one that held during the Kess seismic event, a pause that had weight in it. 68,000 people transited through it in the 48 hours after the event. The official review said the frame was rated for 40,000. The review was using the rated tolerance figure from the original specification, I said. The actual tolerance built into the load path architecture was 30% higher. She was very still. That was deliberate. Standard practice, I said. You build for what you've been asked to build for, and then you build for what you haven't been asked to build for but what might arrive. Because the situation you design for and the situation that actually shows up are not always the same thing. She looked at me. The controlled expression and the treaty table precision were still there, but there was something underneath them now that had not been there when she arrived. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recalibration she had begun in the treaty shed completing itself slowly. Sael wants to stay for the tertiary bracket installation, she said. I've already told her she can observe it from the access platform I built in the trench. Final load test is active load protocol, perimeter only. She'll argue about the perimeter. She's already argued about it. The restriction stands. Something happened at the corner of the Queen's mouth. She respects clear reasons, she said. She has never respected restrictions without them. The reason for the load test perimeter is active load failure probability during primary stress testing, I said. If the frame moves during the test, material failure is possible at speed and at force. Below the perimeter line, tolerable probability and intolerable probability switch positions. I will tell her that. She already knows it. I told her this morning. The Queen looked at me for a moment with a quality of attention that I was beginning to recognize, the looking without performing that was present in Sael and apparently present in the person Sael had grown up watching. "Of course you did," she said. And then, before I could process the shift in her register, she turned back to the frame. "Engineer Orith, when the anchor is operational, when those 14,000 people begin moving through it, I want them to know that the frame was built by someone who understood why it needed to hold." I said nothing. "I do not mean a commendation," she said, still looking at the frame. "I do not mean a public record. I mean they should know. The way a person knows that the ground is sound when they walk on it. The way my daughter knows the collar sequence holds because she watched you fit it." She paused. "Some of those families have been waiting for 3 years. Some of the children in those families have never lived anywhere that was permanent." I looked at the frame. The tertiary bracket sequence was 5 days from completion. The load test was 9 days away. 14 days to operational status, if nothing went wrong. And nothing was going to go wrong because I had built the collar sequence correctly. And I was building the frame correctly. And the material was correct. And the load path architecture was correct, and the only variable left was time. "They'll know because it'll hold," I said. "That's how people know." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "Yes," another pause, "that is how people know." She left. I went back to the tertiary bracket sequence. Sael was at the trench rim when I climbed back up. She had been 10 meters behind me for the entire conversation, which I had registered and said nothing about. She had a rule, which she had stated on day 3 and adhered to reliably. She did not ask questions about conversations that were not hers to be part of. She waited to be told, or she remained in possession of only what she had observed, which was usually enough. She understood the load path geometry, she said. She appeared to. She asks the same kind of questions you ask, the ones about what actually happens, not the ones about what is supposed to happen. She wrote something in her notebook. I think that is where I get it from. I said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. The load test ran on the 14th day. The Bilateral Commission was present. The Compact Corridor Authority Legal Monitor was present. Velkorith was present, standing in the back row of the observation perimeter with his hands clasped at his waist, and his expression professionally neutral, not hostile, not conceding anything, simply present, doing what oversight delegations do at load tests, which is watch and record, and let the structure make its own argument. Oren Veem was present, looking slightly stunned, as he had looked every morning for 2 weeks at the rate at which the frame had been going up. He was a good coordinator, and he had managed the site calendar and the bilateral office communications with reliability and care. And what he was seeing now was the result of his coordination and my construction, and 3 weeks of work in a window that the prior contractor's error had made far too tight. The Queen was present, standing at the perimeter tape, and Sael was standing beside her with the notebook and the pencil, having argued about the perimeter at length the previous afternoon, and received the same answer she had already received and written it down in the notebook anyway. I ran the primary stress test at rated load. The monitoring station showed nominal load transfer efficiency across all 12 collar fittings, all 3 bracket sequences, all sections of the anchor frame. I pushed to 115% of rated load, nominal. I pushed to 120, the tolerance boundary test I ran on every frame, because the situation you design for and the situation that arrives are not the same thing, nominal. Every collar, every bracket, every load path, every number exactly where it was supposed to be. The corridor authority confirmed operational status at the 17th hour. The first transit pod came through the anchor at the 19th hour. 3 families, 11 people, 6 children, all of them going somewhere they could stay. I watched the transit data at the monitoring station. The load readings were what I had built them to be. The frame was not moving. The corridor was open. Behind me, from the direction of the perimeter tape, I heard the Queen say something in Vithrani, 2 words, quiet, not intended for anyone in particular. I did not speak Vithrani. I did not ask. Sael appeared at my elbow. She looked at the transit data. She looked at the collar sequence readings in the monitoring display, the 12 fittings, the load transfer numbers, the frame stability readout. She looked at all of it with the same attention she had brought to every day of the previous 2 weeks, and then she closed her notebook and held it in both hands and looked at the anchor frame through the viewport. "Nominal," she said. "Nominal," I said. We stood at the monitoring station together for the full first hour of operational status, watching the numbers, not looking for problems, looking for confirmation that the solving was complete. The frame held the whole time. At the end of the hour, she said, without looking away from the display, "I'm going to be an engineer." Not a question, not a declaration requiring acknowledgement. A fact being stated in the register she used for all facts, directly, and with more inside it than the words showed. I looked at the transit data. The 19th family had come through the anchor by then. 22 children, counting the family members under a meter tall, going somewhere permanent, going somewhere the ground was sound because someone had built it to be. "You'll be a good one," I said. The notebook went into her bag. The display held its numbers. The frame held its load. Outside the monitoring station, the basalt shelf was cooling as the diurnal cycle turned toward the cold side, and the transit pod lights were moving through the corridor at regular intervals, each one carrying the weight of lives relocating to permanent ground. It was enough. It was, I thought, exactly enough. Not more than required and not less, exactly calibrated to the load, the way a frame is supposed to be. It was more than enough. It was what I had come to Core 7 to build, and I had built it, and it was holding exactly as I had designed it to hold, and nobody on the other side of it was ever going to know the name of the engineer who had corrected the prior contractor's error, and refitted the collar sequence, and answered an 8-year-old's questions about load path analysis for 2 weeks, while also rebuilding an anchor frame from the foundation up. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to go. "When do you leave?" Sael asked. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "Site closeout documentation today, transit at first light." She was quiet. "Then there's a commission on Veth's second moon, the secondary transit hub expansion. The bilateral office will need a lead engineer." She paused. I looked it up. I looked at her, amber eyes, serious and clear, not performing anything. "I know," I said. "Are you going to take it?" I looked at the transit data. The numbers were good. The frame was holding. The work was done. "Yes," I said. She nodded once, the same serious nod she had given me at the trench rim on the first afternoon, the nod of someone absorbing a fact and filing it correctly. Then she opened the notebook again and wrote something in it, and I let her, and we stood at the monitoring station until the second hour completed, and the site coordinator came to tell me the closeout documentation was ready, and I went to go sign it, and the frame continued to hold all the while.